is Migration and Health of the Asian Population Association. Today is our, as I said, the inaugural one, and it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Roman Hoffmann, who leads the Migration and Sustainable Development Research Group at the International Institute for the Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. Dr. Hoffmann holds a PhD in economics from the University of Vienna and degrees in sociology and economics from the University of Munich. His research sits at the forefront of climate demography scholarship, exploring how environmental stressors interact with social, economic, and institutional factors to influence migration decisions and population outcomes. Beyond migration, his work also contributes to understanding public attitude towards climate action and sustainable transition. So I think we are really pleased to have you, Dr. Roman. And this is, as I said, inaugural. We will see how it goes. We wanted this to be led by the PhD student or early career researchers. But I put my hand up as I have worked with you, and Roman and I, we have known each other since 2018 when I was in Vienna for 6 months or 4 months, something, and that's where we started. So welcome, Roman, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation to present here today at this inaugural seminar of the working group. I will share my screen now. I just wanted to say that I plan to present for about 35, maximum 40 minutes, but I would like to invite the audience to interrupt me. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to switch from the presentation to a more interactive session if there are any questions. Otherwise, I will keep going. I hope you can all see my screen now. I will just...
Yeah, it's visible.
Perfect. So today I would like to speak about the intersection between climate change and human mobility and immobility. And I would like to present outcomes of different research projects that we have been producing in the last couple of years together with a number of different co-authors that provide perspectives on this relationship between climate change and mobility and immobility patterns worldwide, and also showcases how this relationship is very nuanced and context dependent. Before I start, I would like to say a few words about my institute, as I believe that many of you may not be familiar with the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. As Santosh mentioned, we are based in Austria, very close to Vienna. And IIASA's mission is basically to provide insights and guidance to policymakers worldwide and addressing global and universal problems through applied systems analysis. So we are like an international research institute bringing together researchers from all over the world and from institutions from all over the world that contribute to understanding better how we can develop global solutions to some of these essential problems that humankind is facing. And of course, one of these issues is climate change that is affecting all parts of human life. And you see here in the graph to the right an illustration of different systems that are interconnected and all affected by climatic factors. And us at IIASA, we try to understand how climate change is interacting with these different systems in complex ways, and also try to understand how populations come into play in these multiple interactions. IIASA is currently consisting of 19 member organizations, national member organizations, and 17 regional member organizations. And you can see here the global scope of the institute. And as you will note, also several Asian countries are part of the IIASA family. In total, in Austria, we have about 560 full-time staff and guest researchers, so people who are also coming from abroad to work at the institute. Our staff consists of members from 60 different countries. This is just for your information. If you're interested, there are many ways of interacting with our colleagues or with the institute. There is different possibilities for visiting us. In particular, I would like to highlight what you can see here on the top left side, our Young Scientist Summer Program, which is an initiative that allows PhD students and candidates to come to Austria for a 3 month period over summer, so the Austrian summer, and to work on a research project in collaboration with a IIASA researcher, and then produce a report that can also be used then for the PhD of the wisest peers. So if you're interested, I've copied here a QR code or the link below, and just for your information, I'd be happy to share the slides after this talk today. So feel free to look up some of the information that I will be sharing after the presentation. At IIASA, I'm leading the Migration and Sustainable Development Research Group. The goal of the group is to understand migration more broadly, human mobility and immobility patterns in an increasingly changing world. You are all aware that the world is facing currently multiple crises and transformation processes that affect our livelihoods, our health and well-being, as well as our economies. And these can, of course, also have implications for human mobility patterns. And our group tries to provide evidence and insights to understand how these effects may play out and have influenced mobility patterns in the past, to then learn something about how future mobility may change, how future migration may change under different evolving challenges that the world is facing. And one of these is, of course, climate change, which leads to multiple damages and challenges across the world with direct effects on the populations affected. This is a few examples of the work that we're doing in the group. So to the left, you see a few examples of data sets that our group has been collecting over the past years, ranging from data sets on migration internationally, but also increasingly considering migration within countries at an increasingly high spatial resolution. We bring these data sets to use in our work, trying to understand in which ways different factors, drivers, influence migration patterns as well as trajectories and outcomes. We use mostly quantitative models, but we are also, in part of our work, also interested in more mixed methods approaches as well as qualitative approaches. And as mentioned before, we then employ these insights from these data sets and models to understand how future migration patterns and mobility at large may change under different processes, under different pathways. And we use these modeling approaches, estimates, not only to understand how the future of migration will look like, but also how populations and demographic change processes at large will evolve in the future. And many of you may be aware of the population projections that are produced by IIASA and the Wittgenstein Center, which provide information about populations and changes in population composition until the end of the century for the whole world and all countries. So today I would like to speak specifically about some of our work on the nexus between climate change and migration. I would like to highlight the complexity that comes with this topic. I would like to in particular highlight the role that local conditions play in shaping whether climatic hazards lead to migration or not. I would also like to highlight that it's not only about climatic factors or more broadly environmental factors, but also about other stresses that can affect populations and undermine their abilities to adapt in place, potentially forcing them to leave their homes when confronted with the impacts of climate change. Then I would like to speak a little bit about differential mobility and immobility patterns, highlighting that within populations we see very diverse patterns in mobility, and that not everyone who is affected by climatic hazards and other hardships ultimately migrates because of these. And finally, I would like to conclude with some reflections on the future of climate migration and what we can learn from empirical insights in how climate change into the future may affect migration patterns, and why we may need to be cautious when it comes to assessing future levels of migration in the context of climate change. So to begin with, I would like to set the stage with some brought insights into the nexus of climate change and migration. So when we speak about climate migration, then we refer to it as any form of migration that is either directly or indirectly caused by changes in the climatic conditions or extreme events that happen in the environments of affected communities and that are related more broadly with the changes in the climatic conditions. Climatic migration is historically not necessarily a new phenomenon. Humans have migrated because of changes in environmental conditions or environmental hardships throughout human history. But of course, today, with the acceleration of the environmental changes that we see due to global warming worldwide and the extreme events that are having a higher frequency, intensity, the topic is having nowadays new dimensions where we see that really large parts of populations are affected by detrimental effects of environmental change processes and extreme events, with also implications for migration and displacement. Generally, we see worldwide that environmental conditions are worsening, climatic hazards have been accelerating, and their frequency, intensity, and unpredictability are increasing. And it is often really this increases in frequency and intensity and unpredictability that make it very hard for affected communities and populations at large to deal with these impacts. So it's not only the effects of one hazard, like a drought, that is really undermining adaptive capacities of populations, but it is the accumulation of multiple impacts that really has damaging effects in the long run for those affected. What is important to highlight here is that climate change is not only a natural phenomenon, but also a social crisis. So it is largely social conditions and structural inequalities that determine who is affected by climatic hazards and who is vulnerable to their impacts. And I want to highlight that very much here, that it's not only about the occurrence of different hazards in different localities, but also the local conditions and issues related to inequalities that drive the level of affectedness of populations. This is illustrated here in this map, which I took from a report of the World Bank, which shows the level of exposure of populations and their vulnerability to climatic hazards worldwide in the year 2021. So what you can see, the gray circles is basically showing the size of the population. And within these gray circles across the different world regions, you see the blue circle showing the amount of people living in this region who are potentially exposed to climate hazards. That means they are directly in spatial proximity to the hazard. And then the red circles within these shows the amount of people in the population who are also, in addition, vulnerable to the hazards they are exposed to, which means they are potentially experiencing negative impacts from these hazards. And it's really this interplay between exposure and vulnerability what constitutes what we consider a climatic risk. And as you can see here, for the Asian context, we see large differences. So for example, while we see that in East Asia and the Pacific, we have large exposure levels where a large number of people are exposed to different climatic hazards, in particular severe storms and flooding events. We see that in South Asia, there is a much larger proportion of people who are in addition also vulnerable to the impacts and hence may face worse effects at large. So again, when we look at climate change impacts, it's important to not only consider natural forces, but also social drivers of differential exposures and vulnerability that very much determine the levels of impacts experienced by local populations. These impacts can have also implications for migration decisions by affecting different drivers of migration, ranging from environmental to social, political, demographic, and economic drivers. And together with households, individual characteristics, as well as intervening obstacles and facilitators, these drivers can ultimately influence whether households decide to migrate or to stay in an area, even if it is affected by environmental hardships. What I want to highlight here is that migration processes are complex, mobility processes are very complex. They are influenced by a number of different factors that also interact very closely, and that can determine to what extent a household is able and willing to migrate, or whether it is constrained in its mobility and hence forced to remain in place or wishes to remain in place. This complexity will also come out in many parts of my presentation, where I will point out how we, with our data and analytical methods, try to overcome some of these complexities underlying migration decisions. When you hear about the topic of climate-related migration in the media, then you may often see media reports like the following, which warn that the future may bring increasing waves of migration due to climate change, mainly people coming from countries in the global south moving towards countries in the global north, often referring to millions and even billions of people who may be forced to migrate either within their countries or abroad because of climate change. And here with my presentation today, I would also like to raise caution with some of these numbers, because due to the complexity of the topic of climate change, environmental risks, and migration, it is not so easy to really pin down an accurate number of people who will in the future be forced to migrate because of climate change. And in some cases, climate change can also lead to the immobilization of people, and we see that also in some of our results. So caution is warranted, and I will provide you some more explanations on this in a moment. What I just said is reflected also when we look at the empirical evidence on the topic of climate change and migration. A couple of years ago, colleagues and I have conducted a meta-analysis on the relationships between environmental hazards on one side and migration outcomes on the other. And you see here the results of this exercise displayed in this figure, where you can see the relationships shown for different studies between, on one side, environmental stress and its effects on migration. And what you can see is that the results of the studies that we included in the meta-analysis are very diverse and very heterogeneous. So we see great differences across the studies, and it is not that environmental hazards lead to increases in migration in all cases considered here, but we see that the results are very different. What we also find is that it's mostly internal as opposed to international migration that is affected by hazards. But also even for internal migration, we see that contextual factors play a huge role in explaining where we see that people change their migration in response to environmental events and where we do not see that. So we asked ourselves the question, why do environmental hazards lead to higher mobility in some contexts, but not in others? And this is the part of my next section where I would like to highlight how local conditions and context matter in shaping climate-related impacts on populations and their migration patterns. I would like to present here insights from a study that we have completed last year, where we have analyzed the impacts of drought and aridity on internal migration processes worldwide. So as I mentioned before, it is typically internal migration as opposed to international migration that is more strongly affected by environmental processes. But there is relatively little evidence linking at a global scale climate change and internal migration. Typically, previous studies have only looked at changes in urbanization patterns if countries are more strongly affected by environmental threats, but there is not a real granular analysis that has been done in this area. So with our study, we wanted to contribute to that, also providing a novel data set on internal migration for the entire world, which we use as a basis for our analysis. Our data was derived from IPUMS International. So for those of you who are not familiar with this data source, IPUMS stands for Integrated Public Use Microdata Series. It's an organization that collects census data from all over the world and does the tremendous effort in harmonizing these census data sets and providing them for public use for researchers and practitioners. As of now, IPUMS has collected censuses from more than 100 countries worldwide, providing really detailed information on populations and their mobility patterns. For our analysis, we have used data from 72 countries, and in particular, we use data on the subnational region of residence of the census takers, which we combined with information about where the census takers have lived 1 or 5 years before the census. And this has allowed us to construct internal migration flow estimates between the different subnational regions within the countries included in our data set. So in practice, it looked like that. This is the scope of our data set, the 72 countries for which we have data. And you can see we have also a number of Asian countries included in the data set. So this data set could also lend itself to further analysis with a focus on Asia specifically. And what you can see here is the country borders, as well as within the countries, the administrative regions, subnational regions. And here, for the example of China, we were able with our data to collect or to calculate how many people have moved from one region in China to another and vice versa. And we can do that for all region pairs across the country, as well as all 72 countries included in the data set. And in total, this resulted in a sample of over 100,000 migration flow estimates between different subnational regions across all 72 countries. And here you see an example for China for the last census, where you see the information about, with actual data of how many people have moved between the different parts of the country in this census period. What is important is that we have this census data not only for one point in time, but for several points in time. And you will see this plays across many of our studies. Using longitudinal information is something that is very important for our estimation, as it allows us really to understand how migration patterns have changed in response to external shocks over time for each of these subnational regions. And that's what we also do here in this analysis. We try to understand to what extent changes in aridity and drought events have led to increased outmigration from subnational regions over time to other regions within the countries. For this, we have combined our migration data with information on drought conditions in the subnational regions of origin of the potential migrants. And you see here, as an illustration, the drought conditions that were faced across the world in the year of 2021, where you see those areas in a darker red facing more severe drought conditions. And for our estimation, we consider drought conditions in different time windows. We use 4 different drought measures, including the aridity index, 2 versions of the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, and the Palmer drought severity index. And all of these capture different elements or aspects of droughts, but broadly they measure the level of water imbalance and dryness in the soil in a particular area. What we find, and I will just give you a snapshot of the result, is that all drought measures are significantly related with our outmigration outcome, which we measure with the IPUMS census data. We estimate that a 1 standard deviation increase in aridity in a region over time leads to an approximate 9.3% increase in the outmigration rate in this area. And we interestingly find deterring effects of drought and aridity in the prospective destinations. So if there is a drought and aridity in an area where people could potentially move to, then they rather don't do that. So we see a reduction in migration towards that area if there has been a drought in these regions. Of course, what we do next is, and this speaks a bit to kind of the point of looking at the context, we try to understand if these effects, these relationships are different for different parts of the world and for different socioeconomic contexts, to understand to what extent different contexts shape the relationship between climatic hazards and migration outcomes. And what we find is that context plays a huge role. So we combine, for example, our migration and drought data set with further information about the characteristics of the socioeconomic characteristics of the regions from where the people may migrate from if the region is affected by drought. And what we find is that it is particularly those areas that are highly agriculturally dependent, as well as less urbanized, so more rural areas, where we see drought to have the strongest effect on migration outcomes, presumably because the populations are more vulnerable to the impacts because they are more strongly dependent on environmental conditions for their livelihoods. We also find that it's more poorer areas within countries where we see stronger outmigration, typically towards urban centers in these countries. We use our estimates to derive a very careful predictions, which you can see here, where we look at patterns of climate-related impacts on migration across different parts of the world, trying to understand where we do see, or where we would expect, based on our model estimates, to see stronger relevance or higher relevance of drought and aridity for migration patterns. And what we find here is that it is particularly areas that are already characterized also by heightened levels of dryness, where we expect to see additional dryness and aridity and drought conditions to have a particularly strong effect. And within these areas, it's particularly those where we have heightened agricultural dependency, more people depending on agriculture for their livelihoods. It is not only those socioeconomic factors that shape differential vulnerabilities, but it's also other risks and stresses that can interact and potentially exacerbate the impacts of climate change on populations and ultimately lead to higher mobility depending on the respective context. This is a topic that I would like to speak to you about now in this next section, to highlight the relevance of compound risks, so overlapping risks that are often overlooked but highly relevant, as they can shape to what extent populations are exposed and also vulnerable to climatic hazards, and to what extent they can experience exacerbated impacts. Often in research, what we do is to consider one climatic hazard and try to understand how it affects mobility patterns in a population. But this, of course, perspective falls short of reflecting the reality that many climatic stressed households experience in their communities. So often, as I have also mentioned before, it is not only one climatic hazard that households face, but it's multiple intersecting hazards that can occur at different points in time and thus cumulatively increase the stress on those affected. And often it is this accumulation of ever more increasingly frequent and intense hazards that ultimately undermines livelihoods and has the strongest impacts on populations. It is not only climatic risks that come into play here when we are thinking about how different stresses can exacerbate each other, but it's of course also non-climatic risks, including political, economic, health-related risks like the COVID-19 pandemic and so on, that can interact with the risks on the environmental side and exacerbate the impacts experienced by population, with potentially very different consequences for mobility and immobility. So you can think of situations where increased stress from such compound events can ultimately lead to more mobility because people are more forced to leave their homes, but it can also lead to more immobilization. But as of today, there's relatively little evidence looking into that. And because of that, with colleagues, we have started working on a number of projects where we try to understand more clearly how migration changes in response to climate change, depending on whether households are exposed to other risk factors and stresses in their environments. And in particular, in this paper, which is still a working paper, we're looking at to what extent climate impacts differ in settings that are facing violent conflict versus non-violent conflict. And as you can imagine, conflicts are an issue that can severely undermine households' abilities to cope with and respond to environmental stress, and hence lead to more detrimental consequences and also to changes in the mobility responses of the households. So here in this paper, we use Gallup World Poll data as our primary data source. So for those of you who are not familiar with Gallup, Gallup collects survey data for about 140 countries worldwide, and provides also information about the subnational region of residence where the survey respondents are living. And this Gallup data is available also since early 2000s already, providing us again with longitudinal information about the local conditions of the survey respondents. We are interested to measure migration aspirations with the Gallup survey, and in particular, we base our analysis on the question, ideally, if you had the opportunity, would you move permanently to another country, or would you prefer to continue living in this country? And from that, we basically assess whether a person has an aspiration to leave the country or not. We combine this information at the subnational regional level with information on whether the region had experienced a drought event in the past year and whether there have been any violent conflicts in the past year. With conflict, we obtain data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program to measure the amount of fatalities that have occurred in a specific subnational region. We have the Gallup data at the yearly level, which allows us to really have a very detailed analysis of how changes over time in migration aspirations are driven by drought, conflict events, and their joint co-occurrence that may potentially exacerbate the impacts of each of these stressful events. This is the data set, the Gallup Migration Aspirations data set for the, I believe for 2023, where you see the share of respondents in the Gallup surveys who have indicated that they have aspirations to migrate, where you see large differences across countries, but also within countries. Again, between the subnational regions within the countries, we see major differences, and this is illustrated here also in this example for example, to the right, South and Central Asia, where you see that, for example, in the Indian case, we have on average very low levels of migration aspirations, but then selected regions show heightened levels of people who wish to leave. Again, as I mentioned, we have this information not only at one point in time, but for several points in time, longitudinal data. And you see this here aggregated, the migration aspirations over time for the different world regions in our data set. We see that in many areas we have seen increases in aspirations to migrate, including also in Asian countries. But then we see like this very marked dip in 2020, which was of course due to the COVID pandemic. What we do in our analysis, we combine this data on migration aspirations over time and the changes in aspirations with information on whether subnational regions have seen increased drought and conflict events over time, to understand to what extent these are driving the changes in the migration patterns. Here what you can see is a map that shows the relevance of considering these compound risks of conflict and drought events together. So here the map shows you regions in light red that have only experienced drought in the period of 2010 and 2019. Then you see regions in light blue that have only experienced conflict events. And then you see regions in the dark purple that have seen both drought and conflict events overlapping, potentially creating compound risk for the affected populations. And as you can see, many of the regions that have also been characterized by major migration outflows in the past decades have actually seen these compound events, for example, in parts of Central and South Asia, as well as in western parts of Asia and the Middle East, North Africa, as well as in parts of Central America. And in particular, I want to point out that also in the border regions in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, we see that a lot of these compound events have taken place and potentially exacerbating the impacts and stress on the affected populations. So we analyze the impact of drought and conflict and the compound effect of these two events on migration aspirations. And the main finding that we have in our paper, you can see displayed here, where you see the effects of drought shown on the x-axis and of conflict shown on the y-axis on the predicted migration aspiration. So darker blue colors means more people have the aspiration to migrate depending on whether they have seen more or less conflict or drought in their subnational regions of origin. And what we find is that while both conflict and drought exert isolated effects on people's aspiration to leave, it is ultimately this joint effect of both stresses together that creates the compound effect and a much stronger effect on migration intentions. So to illustrate that, populations living in areas where both conflict and drought are present have an approximately 14% higher likelihood to showing aspirations to leave an area compared to those populations living in areas where no drought or no conflict have occurred. So it is really this compound nature that can explain differences in migration aspirations in our sample. And I would like to highlight once more that when we think about climatic stress, then it's important to not look at climate in isolation, but to understand how it is part of a broader risk environment that households face in their localities and that can create stress and undermine livelihoods and human security and ultimately lead to more migration. We find that these compound effects are particularly strong in low-income settings, as well again in agriculture-dependent settings, like in the previous case. When we look at these cases, then you may get the impression that climatic hazards necessarily lead to more mobility among those affected. In this next part of my presentation, I would like to briefly highlight that this does not always have to be the case, that it's not as simple, and that climatic hazards do not deterministically and automatically lead to more migration, but that again, local context and population characteristics play a major role in shaping who moves when exposed to climatic hazards and who stays in the origin localities, communities. What is important to note here is also that even though we see that some people become mobile when they are faced with environmental stress, the majority actually remain immobile for various reasons. And it is important also to consider this immobility in addition to mobility effects of climate change, as these are two very important aspects of the same medal. So people, when confronted with climate change impacts, can decide or can be forced to become mobile, but at the same time, they can also remain immobile. And this can also be because of a voluntary decision, because they wish to remain in place. So the majority of the world's population wants to remain in place, even if they had the opportunity to migrate. But immobility can also be the outcome of a forced process where people are not able to leave, even if they wished so. And of course, these populations who are forcefully immobilized or immobile, they have a heightened vulnerability and also are in need of special protection. And climate change can further exacerbate immobility and undermine resources that people need to migrate, and then hence lead to a greater immobilization of populations. This is just a quick graph to underpin what I said before, which shows also based on the Gallup World Poll question, if you had the opportunity, would you like to move permanently to another country or would you prefer to continue living in this country? The graph shows that the majority of the world population, even if they had the possibility, would still wish or desire to remain in their countries without migrating. And in particular, this number is very high in many Asian countries, as you can see here in the darker black shadings. So many people wish to remain in their countries, even if they had the opportunity to migrate abroad. And this, of course, goes against many of the common migration narratives that we face in many of the public debates today, where the underlining narratives are pointing more towards people wishing to leave and migrate in masses, which is definitely not the case as the evidence shows us. We have looked more into these differences in mobility patterns in a study that we had completed a couple of years ago, which focused on the Indian case of Uttarakhand, the region of Uttarakhand in the northern Indian Himalayan region. This was a project led by Ricardo Biela and together with my former colleague Himani Upadhyay. And we have combined here, we have used a mixed methods approach to understand how migration in agriculturally highly dependent communities is shaped by climate impacts and to what extent vulnerability is an important factor in explaining where we see more migration and also explaining who migrates from these communities. We built here this work on a agricultural vulnerability index that was inspired by some work by Shukla et al., which measures aspects related to the sensitivity of communities to environmental stress in Uttarakhand, as well as their possibility to adapt to changes in environmental conditions, which is referred to here as adaptive capacity. And we linked these indicators of different vulnerability dimensions to the outmigration rate in these subnational areas of Uttarakhand. And here you see the state of Uttarakhand shown on the map to the left with the different levels of vulnerability as assessed with the vulnerability index. And what we found when we combined these vulnerability indicators with outmigration is that they could, to a large extent, explain where climatic factors have led to greater mobility from an area. And in particular, it was dimensions related to the adaptive capacity of populations and communities that were particularly important for explaining where we saw more people leaving, as well as higher numbers of migrants from these communities. And in particular, it was issues related to agroecological capacity, so the ways how agriculture systems were able, for example, through irrigation, to cope with environmental stress in these different areas. We also looked at, for those households that had people migrating, for those areas where people migrated from, we tried to understand better what the motivations were for the migration and also who the people were who migrated. So for this, my colleague Himani conducted interviews with local residents. And we found very much that mobility patterns were very diverse, as I indicated before. It was mainly younger people who were more likely to migrate from the more vulnerable communities, and also gender played an important role. Mainly it was younger men who left, also younger women. Mainly it was more older women who were remaining in the villages, which of course came then with a number of implications also in terms of maintaining the village life and care work as well as agricultural production in these areas. So diversity in mobility responses to environmental stress are very, very important to consider. As a last part of my short presentation, before ending, I would like to briefly share some reflections on the future of climate migration, and I will keep this rather short so we still have time for discussions and questions. I just would like to highlight that it is very difficult to assess how climate change will affect the future of migration and when we will see whether we will see more or less migration because of climate change. And partly this is due to some of the issues that I mentioned before, that in some cases climatic factors may lead to more migration. In other cases, it may rather immobilize populations. So it's not so clear to what extent really more migration will be the outcome. What is clear is that climate change will result in increasing it will increasingly affect communities worldwide, and that the impacts will, over the next decades, increasingly intensify, and also diminishing, of course, the well-being and the livelihoods of the communities affected. We have in a recent publication, and invite you to look this one up if you're interested in these questions around the future of climate migration. We have written a perspectives piece with a number of authors where we have reflected on what our empirical evidence can tell us today about the future of migration and why caution is warranted, because often, even if there are numbers involved, for example, in projections, these come with a lot of assumptions that only show us one possible future and may not reflect very accurately what we can expect in terms of future climate impacts on people and migration patterns. And maybe to end, why is this important? Because, of course, the way how we think about future waves of migrants can very much influence the policies that are being made today that can have very harmful consequences also for those people who are affected by climate change and who are forced to migrate, because possibilities to migrate for these people may get increasingly more challenging, with, of course, then also implications again for their well-being and human security. And with this, I would like to come to the end to highlight some of the key takeaways from my talk. We have spoken a lot about the impacts of climate change, but I just would like to highlight that, of course, mitigation is also a key element. So preventing future levels of climate change can ultimately protect affected communities. And we're now at a crucial stage where the world really has to decide if we want to continue emitting as we used to, or if we want to cut emissions in a way that allows us also to prevent some of the most disastrous consequences of climate change. Besides mitigation, targeted adaptation and resilience building efforts are needed. Besides mobility and mobile populations, it's important to also consider those immobile and immobilized because of climate change, and to always remember that not everyone is willing or able to leave a place, even if they are facing heightened risks, and that all populations, mobile and immobile, they need social, legal, and political protection to being able to navigate the consequences of climate change. And finally, when we talk about climate change impacts on populations and their migration and mobility, then it's important to remember that it's a social crisis, climate change, and that it's ultimately social factors and inequalities that underlie much of the disruptive effects that we see of climate on people, and that it's equally important to look at compounding risk factors in interconnected crises that can undermine people's abilities and capacities to respond. Before I close, I would just like to highlight, in case you're interested in the topic, that we have a conference on migration planned that will take place 19th to 21st of November, online and in person in Vienna. It's open for registration and free of charge. So if you're interested in the topic, please feel free to join us online, of course also in person. And we would be very happy to have you being part of this event. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for the attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion and exchange.
Great. Thank you. What a presentation. Honestly, this is one of the best presentations I have gone for, Roman. It is like such a rich journey for me, data, context, conceptual frontiers, everything. I have few questions, but I give others to chance if they have some questions to ask. The floor is open now for questions. Anyone? Or if you want me to, I can start. Okay, I think I will start. I have many questions, but I will reserve those questions given the time frame. First thing, I thought of Gallup survey. I was not aware of it, but my main question was, I'm an epidemiologist as well as a demographer, and first thing that came to mind was ecological fallacy, which you would be aware of. The error of making assumption about individuals based on the data from the larger group, whether it is the country or what. So I just thought, how do you deal with it? Because you have this individual data, whether they have the aspiration to move internationally, and then you have the country level data about drought or other conditions or whatever. So this was my one thing. And second thing was, the question was asked about the international movement, but your presentation showed that it's more internal migration rather than the international. So I just thought, if you have the chance, whoever does the survey design or whatever, to put a question, because internationally it may be different, but people may like, I know in Australia there are certain pockets where we have the floods and droughts, and people move domestically, but not internationally, as you rightly pointed out in your presentation. So this is one. I'll stop here, but I have a few other. I'll see how it goes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Santosh, for the questions. I also saw that Mriganka had a question before, but somehow his audio was not working. But maybe after my answer, you can come in if you like. So about the ecological fallacy, that's of course an important point, and one that we also always discuss in our papers. For the Gallup level analysis, we base actually the main findings are based on individual level data. So we have over 4 million individual level records from Gallup respondents. So we look at really how the macro level changes in the condition. And again, I want to emphasize the changes in the regions. So it's not that we're comparing India and Australia, for example, and looking at their conditions, but we look at each subnational region and we compare it to itself over time, and we try to understand what happens to people living in this area if there is a change over time in the environmental conditions, and then how does that basically affect at the micro level the individual desire and aspiration to leave the country. And this brings me to the second question. You're right. So much of the literature, including ours, has shown that it's mainly internal as compared to international migration that is more strongly affected. Gallup also has a question that is more kind of relating to internal movements. So that's more like a question about, do you think you wish to live in the same community in the next 12 months? So we have done the same analysis also with this outcome, and the results were perfectly robust to that. So it is really more the wish of the people, the individuals, to really leave, that is driving these effects. It's of course, and also just to highlight that again, just because someone shows the aspiration to leave does not mean the person has the ability to do so. So we may see large changes in the aspiration and desire to leave, but not necessarily does not mean that this can be one-to-one translated into actual migration
Yeah, I
behavior
think this is a
actually
big thing
because of
in
the concerns.
epidemiology. For example, saying individual level blood pressure data and then linking that the stroke one, it's a good example of ecological
Mm.
fallacy. But yeah, I got your point. Does Gallup got data on Pacific? Do
They
you
do,
know?
I think. I don't know every question. One would have to look it up.
Yeah, I
I
will.
can be happy
I
to.
definitely got interested into that.
Yeah,
I will look it up. Yep.
Hello,
Yep.
hello,
fantastic.
ma'am.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're
Yeah.
audible now.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for your presentation. I must say, like this is one of the best presentation on climate-induced migration I have ever attended. Also, let me introduce. I am Mriganka Burman, currently a PhD scholar from agriculture economics from Northeast India. I'm basically a student from agriculture background, but I'll like in my PhD, I'm just in my like primitive stage of my PhD. So I'll be working on climate-induced migration in Assam. So firstly, this study have not been done in our region, especially in Assam is one of the most affected, flood affected state of India. So but these research have not been done yet, so it is for quite difficult for me to find reference and all. And regarding like I have planned to do on the primary data only, because in our region like till now I have not gone through or I have not find any of the secondary data or migration. Specifically it just in 2011 census is there, which is very old. On other migration data is not available, and also for climate induced migration it's not available. So regarding this I just want to hear from you, sir, like to suggest something like how can you how can I proceed with my study, because this will be my sole study for my PhD degree, sir. Thank you so much to get connected with you, sir. I got randomly today only I got in my LinkedIn I got the poster, and I just gone through the link, and I'll also register for the conference which is going to happen in 19 and 20 in Vienna, sir. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Okay,
Great.
yeah,
Here
thanks a
you
lot for
go,
the
Roman.
question.
Here is a chance to supervise, start supervision.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the
Thank you so
question, and
much for your-
great to hear. Yeah, great to hear about your interest. About the data question, this is of course a very important question, and especially in the Indian context. I see that my colleague Rimjim Bajpai is also with us today. She has done and recently only completed a study on India, looking also into like the relationship between different environmental hazards on migration using census data. Rimjim, maybe if you want to either share the link if it's already available to the study, please feel free to do so, or share maybe in the chat your email so colleagues can reach out to you if interested. Generally in India, you have a lot of microdata survey data sets that could be useful, and potentially the DHS survey has information on absenteeism of household members. So whether household members have been gone for more than 2 months in a period. So that can serve as a proxy for some short-term mobility. I'm not sure about the Indian Human Development Survey. They also have this information, but these surveys can provide some proxy measures that you can use to assess some of these impacts that I've shown in some of these more larger scale studies.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much,
Great.
sir. Actually, like I have done one bibliometric analysis on climate-induced migration, and it's our university. This is the first study, and my like reference was like I have given you 2 3 reference, and today when I saw your poster, and like I was feel like I was very happy to see you. Like I have gone through your papers, but right now I am like talking to you in live, so it's very nice to hear from your answer, and I'll stay connected with your works.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for the time, sir. It's great. It's great time with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Santosh, there's
Thank
another
you.
question in the chat as
Any
well. Just
other
wanted to point
one?
that out.
Anyone else?
There is one more question by Nick McTurk in the chat. I just saw that.
Yeah. It is on circular migration, something on circular migration.
Right. So that's of course a very important point, and something that may go missing in the census data that we're using. So the census IPOMS data kind of covers periods of like migration in the last 5 years roughly, that we consider in most of our observations. And of course, within these 5 years, we know just the amount of people who have moved from one region A to another region B, but we are not really able to assess how many people have gone back and have moved on and so on. So there is a lot of still underlying complexity in this whole migration processes and systems that we are missing with these data sets. We have also a part of a discussion in the paper and in the supplement where we kind of have some elaborations on this. But still, the census data is one of the best to really assess comparatively internal migration patterns across such a large number of countries, but it comes with its own challenges and pitfalls.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else before we wrap up? I will reserve my questions because we are going to have big discussions, Roman, when I'm there in Vienna. Yes, for the sake of time. Last chance for anyone. All right. It seems like we're up with the
I
questions.
can go
Let-
ahead with one. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead,
Oh.
Arushi. Why not? Because you are working on our paper. So
Yeah,
that's a chance. You can ask about the paper as well.
Yeah, so I was going through some of the papers, and it was really nice presentation by you. But I just wanted to know, like, as you said that there are different systems approach, like which affects migration. Is there any standard questionnaire or any standard study or anything that has been done so far, which sees that was the migration and like, was the migration successful or was it a failure? Like, is there any kind of standard list or any questionnaire which is developed, something?
Yeah, thanks very much. It's also an excellent question. So the whole question of kind of what is the outcome of the migration? Does it ultimately help the people to potentially better adopt and cope with the impacts of climate change? What is the consequences for families? And that is a very important topic that is discussed in the literature, but there is very little evidence on that. So that is a bit of a blind spot, simply also because of the challenges with the migration data. So typically one doesn't follow the migrants in the migration process through. So you kind of look either at like origin areas and then try to understand is anyone in the household absent, or you go to the destination areas and try retrospectively to link back to, but you cannot really follow up whether they had actually seen improvements. There are a few micro data sets that are available, panel data sets, for example, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, where they have followed migrants through more rigorously. So where something, what you ask, could be done. There are no necessarily standards as to how this could be assessed. So generally in this migration field, there's a lot of complementary approaches that can be used. But definitely data would be available, and also different sort of analytical approaches that could be taken as a basis for doing something like what you said. And maybe just generally, if anyone has follow-up questions beyond that, happy if you reach out to me via email. And as I said before, I'd also be happy to share my slides.
There is one
Okay.
online question, if you can look from
I-
Rupert. There is one question, Roman, if you look in the chat, or I can read out for you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, local institutions and their role for shaping some of these processes, they play a key role, like also social networks, social environments, how people are connected, and what like institutional setups that allow people to realize mobility, for example, can play a very large role. And this also pertains to cross-border movements. So we see that in some regions, institutions and migration systems are put in place that facilitate cross-border movements, also circular mobility, as was asked before. And these can play a huge role in shaping migration processes. And they also play an enormous role, and I cannot go into the details now because of the time, but institutions also play a huge role in the extent to which households and communities are affected by the impacts of climate change. They can act as protective sources and help mitigating risks, but they can also, if they are not well established and having detrimental characteristics, can also have negative implications for the people affected. And so they play a very large role across all aspects of this nexus.
I have a question. So Roman, it's a very analytical presentation, and thank you very much. So regarding this aspiration, there are other things also like education, and maybe that people may have higher aspiration because they want better environment condition. So when we look at out migration rate in Indian states, and some of our states are very known for out migration, for example, Bihar or Uttar Pradesh. but out migration rate is much higher in Delhi. Delhi is the area where in migration rate is also high, but out migration rate is higher than any of these bigger states. But, so what we are seeing for the last few days, that the air quality of Delhi has been going down, and many during the last few years, many have moved out from Delhi, going outside. So environmental conditions can also induce migration of the richer classes, the elites, the lifestyle migration. And this could be, I think they have the capability also, capability matching with the aspiration. So that is one comment. Second, I like that you have almost demolished one of the migration narratives. That is, the mass migration will result due to climate change or climate crisis. That may not happen. So migration is area where several narratives flourishes, and some of the narratives are very, very counterproductive economically, threat to the nation. So many things are there, but this is one of the narratives, that climate change will produce mass migration and there will be border migration, international migration. So that's a good thing that I appreciate. You mentioned about Uttarakhand. I just visited recently last week, Uttarakhand, Pauri Garhwal near that H.N. Bahuguna University, Srinagar. And now things are happening. Human intervention has made the crisis, compound risk, much more severe because of road construction and then the disaster and the landslides, and then many people are getting affected. So this compound nature of risks are also getting multiplied by our human intervention. So it is very complex, I agree. So thank you very much for your nice presentation and very enlightening and enriching for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments.
Thank you. Do you want to quickly say something before I wrap up, Roman?
I would just like also to reconfirm what you said, that migration is of course driven by multiple factors that are often closely interconnected. And environment is just one of the factors that come into play in this very multi-causal phenomenon. And that these are often kind of intersecting the motivations of why people move. And other motivations, depending on the context, can of course be much more important relative to now what we see, for example. And I very much liked also what you said about that for different groups, like the motivations can be very different, and environmental pollution can be likewise allowing richer classes to leave, richer groups to leave certain polluted areas, whereas this is not a possibility for those who are more restricted in their capacities and more vulnerable also to the impact. So it's a very multidimensional phenomenon, environment migration, that is largely determined also by factors like social status and poverty, and it's very important to take these also into account here.
Great, thank you very much. Now, on behalf of the Asian Population Association and our panel, thank you once again for sharing your expertise and actually for inspiring us to think more critically on this issue, and also about the collaboration. The thing that came to my mind, that you really have to collaborate on this climate-related mobility and its implication, particularly for sustainable development. So, and thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward seeing you in our next seminar. We will post it on LinkedIn and other media, but thank you everybody for the seminar. Thank you, Roman.
For
See
that
you
one
soon, and I'll
program,
talk to you on Friday. Yeah, thank you.
Thank
before
you,
that,
everyone.
Naseem,
We
you have
can
taken?
stay. Arushi, you can go. We can and
Everybody can
Roman,
go,
you
but
can go. We stay for our some discussions. Now.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Talk to you on Friday.
Bye. Talk to you soon.
thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.